Thank you, Bishop Senior. Thank you, Jamie. And thank you all for coming out to hear me. I'm going to take off my jacket because I anticipate the room is going to approach 98.6 at some point. So many people think that there's some kind of conflict between science and religion. I'm sure all of you are aware of this, and it's probably why some of you are here tonight. When people find out that I am a scientist and a religious believer, sometimes they ask me whether I have any difficulty reconciling the two. And I've always found that a kind of strange question. Many of the same things that make me a Catholic made me go into science. A sense of wonder, a passionate desire to know the reasons behind things, and a passionate desire a deep conviction that everything holds together in some coherent way. For me, both the Catholic faith and modern science are ways of help us to make sense of the world. Science tells us about the things that we can observe and measure, but our faith has a much wider scope and answers much deeper questions. Questions about the ultimate cause of the world's existence and order, the purpose of human life, and our ultimate destiny. It tells us about spiritual realities, about God and man, love and truth, good and evil, sin and redemption. The Catholic faith and empirical science are two perspectives on reality that see things in different but not in conflicting ways. I've been a scientist for 41 years and a Catholic for 65 years, and I know of no scientific fact that conflicts with any Catholic doctrine. So why do so many people think that there is some kind of conflict between science and religion? There are many reasons. One is that many people lump all religion together, so that if they see an example of a superstitious belief or magical practices, that counts to them as evidence of the irrationality of all religion. And many people fail to see a distinction between science itself and a certain philosophy that is called scientific materialism. What is scientific materialism? Materialism is the idea that all reality is reducible to matter and its behavior. Scientific materialists are people who think that materialism is somehow implied by modern science. Now, this is an opinion that is held by many scientists and by many people who claim to speak for or to speak in the name of science. But it has no claim to being science. It is just a philosophical opinion, a metaphysical stance. And not all scientists, not necessarily even majority of scientists, hold it. Now, if matter were the only reality, then of course God could not exist, because God is not a material entity. But also, human spiritual souls would not exist. A human being would be nothing more than a complex arrangement of atoms, a complex structure made of atoms. And everything about a human being would be ultimately explicable in terms of the laws of physics that govern how those atoms move. In other words, scientific materialism implies not only that God does not exist, but that strictly speaking, you don't exist either. At least not in the way that you have thought you existed. The popular astronomer and science writer, the late Carl Sagan, put it this way: I am a collection of water, calcium, and organic molecules called Carl Sagan. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, wrote, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. For some of it, by the way, this is good news in a sense, because the new atheists who we are contending with are very radical. They're not just atheists. They're materialists for the most part. There are many people who might prefer to believe that God doesn't exist. Most people are uncomfortable with the idea that they don't exist. And so we have a certain advantage in this fight. Now, for some of its adherents, scientific materialism is more than a philosophy. It's a passionately held anti-religious ideology that sees science as having a saving mission. And that mission is to free the human mind from superstition and irrationality in all its forms, and they count religion as a form of irrationality and superstition. Now, for such people, it is not enough that science is good and brings us understanding of the world. There must be an enemy to be vanquished. And they cast religion in that role. And that explains, I think, the strange zeal that some materialists, I'm thinking of people like Richard Dawkins and some other scientists among the new atheists, have in propagating their ideas. They feel that they're taking part in a grand struggle between reason and its enemies. Now, scientific materialists have a very well-developed critique of religion, which has at least three aspects: a philosophical, historical, and scientific. Their philosophical claim is that there is an inherent contradiction between the scientific and religious outlooks. Inherent, apart from anything science has actually discovered. Science is based on reason and evidence, whereas religion, they say, is irrational because it is based on dogma, faith, and mystery, which involve belief in things that cannot be seen and for which supposedly there is no evidence. Science is based on natural explanations of natural phenomena. It's based on natural laws, whereas religion is based on miracles and the supernatural. They see religion as a matter of myth and magic, and therefore the very antithesis of a rational scientific outlook. Their historical claim is that religious believers and institutions have been hostile to science and have tried to suppress it. And this is powerfully symbolized for many people by our church's treatment of Galileo 400 years ago. But this impression is constantly being reinforced in the public mind by the never-ending battle against evolution by fundamentalist Christians. The materialist scientific claim is that the actual discoveries of modern science over the last 400 years have debunked or undermined basic Christian beliefs about the universe and our place in it. As the story is often told, science has dealt one blow after another to the religious conception of the world. Copernicus showed that man is not at the center of the universe. Newtonian physics showed that nature is no purposes or goals, but is purely mechanical and governed by blind and impersonal forces. Modern astronomy showed how small and insignificant we are compared to the cosmos as a whole. Darwin, some say, showed that human life is an accident and that human beings differ only in degree from lower animals. Advances in neuroscience and artificial intelligence are thought to be demonstrating that the supposed soul is nothing but the working of the brain, a complex biochemical computer. And modern cosmology is invoked to show either that the universe had no beginning or that the universe created itself out of nothing by a quantum fluctuation. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the materialists' philosophical and historical claim that religion, and Christianity in particular, are inherently contrary to science and historically have been its enemies. In the last part of the talk, I'll discuss some of the things modern physics has discovered and argue that they are actually more consistent with what Catholics believe than with what materialists and atheists believe. So let's start with the supposed opposition between the supernaturalism of religion, of biblical religion, and the naturalism of science. Now, Christianity and Judaism were never based on supernaturalism, if you mean by that a rejection of the idea that there's a natural order. In fact, scholars tell us that the book of Genesis was in part an attack on the supernaturalism and superstition of ancient pagan religion. When Genesis said that the sun and moon were merely lamps placed by God in the heavens to light the day and the night, it was attacking the paganism that worshipped the sun and moon as gods. When Genesis said that man is made in the image of God and is to exercise dominion over the animals, and Genesis was, among other things, attacking the paganism in which men worshipped and bowed down to animals or to gods made in the image of animals. In paganism, the world was filled with occult forces and populated by numerous deities, gods of the ocean, of the forests, of the sun and the moon, of fire, of lightning, of wind, of sex and fertility, and so forth. Jews and Christians, however, taught that there is only one God who is not to be sought within nature, within its phenomena and forces, but who is outside of nature, who is indeed the author of nature. In this way, biblical religion stripped the world, the universe, of divinity and made it into a natural world, no longer the abode of gods, but the creation of God. And since God is good, the natural world was seen as something good and worth studying. And since God is intelligent and wise, the world he made must reflect this. It must therefore have been made according to principles and laws that can be discovered and understood by reason. Biblical religion then taught that there is a natural order which comes from God, and what characterizes this natural order and reflects the rationality of its creator is precisely that it is orderly, harmonious, and lawful, and beautiful. Consider this passage from the letter of Clement, St. Clement, to the church in Corinth, written about 97 A.D. St. Clement, as I'm sure you know, was a bishop of Rome, listed in ancient documents as the third pope after St. Peter. The heavens, he says, the heavens as they revolve beneath his government, do so in quiet submission to him. The day and the night run the course he has laid down for them. Sun, moon, and the starry choirs roll on in harmony at his command. none swerving from his appointed orbit. Laws of the same kind sustain the fathomless deeps of the abyss and the untold regions of the netherworld. The impassable ocean and all the worlds that lie beyond it are themselves ruled by the like ordinances of the Lord. Upon all of these, the great architect and Lord of the universe has enjoined peace and harmony. Or consider this passage, one of my favorites, from the Latin Christian apologist Minucius Felix, writing around 200 AD. This is addressed to pagans who do not believe in a creator God. He says, if upon entering some home, you saw that everything there was well tended, neat, and decorative, you would believe that some master was in charge of it and that he was himself much superior to those good things. So too, in the home of this world, when you see providence, order, and law in the heavens and on earth, believe that there is a Lord and author of the universe, more beautiful than the stars themselves and the various parts of the whole world. Look what these texts, and I could give you many, many other similar texts from the early church, look what they point to as evidence of God. Not to supernatural phenomena or miraculous departures from the order of nature, but to the order of nature itself and its lawfulness. The ancient argument was that if there is a law, there must be a lawgiver. God was the lawgiver to Israel, but not only to Israel. He was also the lawgiver to the cosmos itself. God says in Jeremiah 33:25, when I have no covenant with day and night and have given no laws to heaven and earth, then too will I reject the descendants of Jacob and of my servant David. Psalm 148 tells of God establishing the sun, the moon, the stars, and the heavens by a decree or law. The idea that God is a rational lawgiver very likely helped give birth to the idea that there are laws of nature, as even some atheists at times concede. For example, the eminent biologist Edward O. Wilson suggested the following, and he is himself an atheist, or he says skeptic, but I think that's a polite word for atheist. Wilson suggested the following as the reason that Chinese civilization, for all its impressive scientific achievements, did not produce a Newton or a Descartes. He said, Chinese scholars had abandoned the idea of a supreme being with personal and creative properties. No rational author of nature existed in their universe. Consequently, the objects they meticulously described did not follow universal principles. In the absence of a compelling need for the notion of general laws, thoughts in the mind of God, so to speak, little or no search was made for them. And the well-known cosmologist André Linde, also an atheist, has suggested that the notion of a universe governed by, quote, a single law in all its parts is historically rooted in monotheism. Now, our faith, of course, does teach that there are supernatural realities, such as divine grace, which have effects in the world. But the word supernatural, which means above the natural, would make no sense unless there were a natural order in the first place. And the concept of miracles, which are extraordinary events that go beyond what is naturally possible, presupposes that there is a natural order that determines what is naturally possible and what is not. There's no logical contradiction between the idea of miracles and the idea of a lawful universe. For the same lawgiver who established the laws of nature can also suspend them or override them for some sufficiently important purpose. And as we'll see, and that what is that purpose? In salvation history, it's the salvation of souls. And as we'll see, the men who led the development of modern science in its first few centuries, the pioneers in uncovering the laws of nature, such as Isaac Newton, were almost all devout Christians who believed in miracles. Now, there's a lot of confusion today, even among religious believers, about how nature relates to God. Instead of seeing God as the author of nature, they see God and nature as somehow opposed or in competition. So there's something as a natural explanation, then God has nothing to do with it. And if God is the cause of something, well, then it must be supernatural. So therefore, many look for evidence of God only in what lies outside the ordinary course of nature or is inexplicable naturally, inexplicable by science. That is, in the gaps in our scientific understanding. Hence the expression, the God of the gaps. And atheists think that by closing those gaps, we leave no place for God to hide. The traditional Christian view is quite different. If God, as creator of the natural world, established its laws and gave to things their natural powers, then his existence is evident in nature itself and its ordinary processes, just as much as he is evident in miracles. This is the message of the following passage from the Book of Wisdom, a Jewish work of about 50 BC, which is part of the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Old Testament. Whoops, this is the misconception I just talked about, God versus nature. So here's what the Book of Wisdom said. I recommend you go home and read chapter 13 of the Book of Wisdom, because it's the only passage in all of Scripture, I think, that is really addressed directly to scientists. It was directed to the scientists, philosophers of ancient Greece. But it applies just as much today. For all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works. But they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air or the circle of the stars or turbulent water or the luminaries of heaven were the gods that rule the world. If through delight in the beauty of these things people assumed them to be gods, let them know how much better than these is their Lord, for the author of beauty created them. And if people were amazed at their power and working, let them perceive from them how much more powerful is the one who formed them. For from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their Creator. Notice that it actually goes on in a very interesting passage, which is not to the point I'm talking about now, but I recommend you go read the whole thing. Notice that the evidence of God to which this scriptural passage points consists of phenomena and processes that are perfectly natural. Fire, wind, swift air, the circle of the stars, turbulent water, and the luminaries of heaven, that is, the sun and moon and stars. Now, medieval theologians distinguished two ways in which God acts in the world. He can act directly in a supernatural manner, for example, turning water into wine, or he can accomplish his will through the operation of natural causes and processes, which in the terminology of theology are called secondary causes. It has always been the Christian view that God ordinarily acts in the latter way, through natural causes, through secondary causes. In the words of the great scholastic theologian Francisco Suarez, God does not interfere directly with the natural order where secondary causes suffice to produce the intended effect. This principle was important for the founding of science, for it implied that when confronted by some puzzling event or a new phenomenon, we should look first for natural explanations. Superstitious people tend to see the supernatural in every unusual or strange event. But this was criticized by the great medieval scientist, theologian, and philosopher Nicholas Oresme. In explaining marvels of nature, he said, "There is no, quote, there is no reason to take recourse to the heavens or to demons or to our glorious God, as if he would produce these effects directly, any more than he directly produces those effects whose natural causes we believe are well known to us," unquote. Another great medieval scientist and philosopher, Jean Buridan, wrote, "The philosophers," and by that, in those days, that included scientists, "the philosophers explain such marvels by appropriate natural causes, but common folk, not knowing of causes, believe these phenomena are produced by a miracle of God, which is usually not true," unquote. That's why the Catholic Church does not declare a miracle to be worthy of belief until it has excluded the likelihood of natural explanations. Natural explanations are the default value. So now this brings me back to the crucial theological distinction or idea of secondary causes and the distinction between primary and secondary cause. I think the failure to grasp this distinction is one of the main reasons that some people see a conflict between science and religion. This distinction has been explained in many ways. I think the simplest and clearest explanation is based on a simple analogy. And by using the terms vertical and horizontal cause rather than primary and secondary cause. The analogy is to a play or a novel. In the play Hamlet, the character Hamlet kills the character Polonius by stabbing him through a curtain. So consider the following question. I'm going to take a vote. Okay. Did Polonius die in the play Hamlet because the character Hamlet stabbed him through a curtain? All raise your hands if you think that. Good. You should all raise your hands because I just told you that that's what happens in the play. Now, how many of you think that Polonius died because Shakespeare wrote the play that way? Okay. So you see, it's an absurd choice. I gave this talk in Chicago and I said, look, in Chicago you can vote twice. In fact, you should vote twice because they're both correct answers. Shakespeare and they're both causes, but at different levels. Hamlet, the character Hamlet, is the cause, and his stabbing of Polonius is the cause of Polonius' death within the plot of the play. Whereas Shakespeare, so that's the horizontal cause, if you will. But Shakespeare is the vertical cause. He is the cause of the entire play. He is why there is a play at all. He's why there are characters, Hamlet and Polonius. He's the cause of every event in the play and of all the mutual relationships among the characters and events, including the causal relationship. So he's not only causes Hamlet to be stabbing Polonius, but that to be the cause of Polonius' death. So he's the cause of the whole shebang. There's obviously no competition or conflict between these two kinds of causality, the horizontal and the vertical. By analogy, the natural causes within the universe, which are studied by not only scientists but by everybody, are the horizontal or secondary causes. While God, as the author of nature, is the vertical or primary cause. He is the author of the whole plot of the universe. This makes it clear how silly it is to treat evolution and creation as alternatives, as both fundamentalists and atheists do. Did this species of animal, did giraffes arise by some natural processes, or because God wrote nature's plot that way? both. Of course, both. So this makes it clear also why scientific materialists are wrong to think that we believe in God or believe in our faith without evidence. For materialists, evidence consists either in what you can perceive with your senses or what you can infer as to exist as the natural cause of what you're observing. In the way that you observe a compass needle move with your senses and you infer that there's a magnetic field causing that, even though human beings cannot sense magnetic fields. But obviously God cannot be seen in either of those ways. For God is not a part of nature, which we could sense, nor is he a natural cause. He's not a cause within nature. And yet God is a cause. He is the ultimate cause. He is not a cause within nature. He is the cause of nature. And so nature gives evidence of God in the same way that a play or novel gives evidence of its author, even if the author does not appear in the pages of the novel or play, or the way a musical composition gives evidence of its composer, even though the composer does not appear among the notes. Okay, so now let's turn to history. The materialist historical critique of religion. The idea that Christianity, and the Catholic Church in particular, opposed science and tried to hold it back is called by historians the conflict thesis. It has been rejected by contemporary historians of science as a recent invention. The idea that science was born in conflict with religion and that there were two warring camps, the religious camp and the scientific camp, is projecting onto the past ideas that only arose in the late 19th century. In the first few centuries of modern science, the scientific people were part of the scientific camp, but they were also part of the religious camp because they were themselves religious. There were not two camps. Consider the great figures of the scientific revolution. I won't list all of them, but I'll list some of the top ones. The scientific revolution really was exploded in the 1600s. Virtually all of these great figures of the scientific revolution were devout Christians. Copernicus, whose work sparked that revolution, was an official of the Catholic Church. He was the canon of Frauenburg Cathedral. Johannes Kepler, famous for his 3 laws of planetary motion, was a devout Lutheran who announced the discovery of one of his laws with these words: "I thank you, Lord God, our Creator, that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work of creation." That was the attitude of scientists for hundreds of years. Galileo, despite his troubles with the church authorities, remained a devout Catholic throughout his life. Descartes believed in God and that human beings possess immaterial spiritual souls, and he professed himself an Orthodox Catholic. Blaise Pascal was not only a mathematician and physicist of genius, but a Catholic whose life had been transformed by a mystical experience and who wrote in defense of Christian belief against religious skepticism. Robert Boyle, the first modern chemist and founder of chemistry, often regarded as the founder of chemistry, was a pious Anglican who wrote theological works and left a large sum of money to endow a series of lectures whose purpose was to combat the ideas of, quote, notorious infidels, which meant religious unbelievers, atheists and non-Christians. Isaac Newton, the greatest of them, spent as much time on theological and scripture study as he did on science and mathematics. All of them saw their work as showing the beauty of God's creation rather than as supporting atheism. And this was true well beyond the 17th century. The 2 greatest physicists of the 19th century, Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell were deeply devout Protestants. Moreover, the scientific revolution did not spring from thin air. Its foundations were laid in the universities of medieval Europe, as has been strongly emphasized by the eminent historian of science Edward Grant. It was in those medieval universities, which were of course Catholic institutions, that for the first time in human history, science was studied and taught on a continuous basis from generation to generation by a stable community of scholars. That is, where science was first, as Professor Grant put it, institutionalized. By the end of the Middle Ages, there were 100 universities in Europe, and they produced hundreds of thousands of graduates who were introduced to scientific questions and from whose ranks scientific talent could emerge. The scientific community and scientific public these universities created were the soil in which the seeds of the scientific revolution germinated. A little known fact that I like to talk about at this seminary in particular, which illustrates the positive role the Catholic Church has played in the development of science, is the large number of Catholic priests who made major discoveries, not just priests who did science, but who made significant discoveries in science. I have only time to mention a few of the most outstanding. I'm going to skip the Middle Ages and go directly to the 17th century, the century of the scientific revolution. Niels Stenson, also known as Steno, his Latinized name, is famous in three branches of science: anatomy, crystallography, and geology. He was one of the greatest anatomists of his time. He made major discoveries about the glandular and lymphatic system, as well as about the heart and the brain. But his greatest achievement was developing the theory of sedimentary rocks and the origin of fossils, which unlocked the history of the Earth, and for which he is regarded as one of the principal founders of the science of geology. He is the first person to understand where sedimentary rocks came from and how they were laid down and how fossils formed. He became eventually a priest. He was a Danish by birth. He was a Lutheran by upbringing and conviction. He converted to Catholicism, became a priest, was eventually made a bishop, as he was known for his rigorous asceticism and concern for the poor. He was declared Blessed Nicholas Steno by Pope John Paul II. Marin Mersenne, another remarkable figure, a friar of the Mennonite order, is considered the founder of acoustics for fundamental discoveries in the theory of sound and vibrations. He was the first person to measure the speed of sound. He made important contributions also to the theory and design of reflecting telescopes. His religious house became a meeting place of famous scientists. It's the place where, for example, Descartes and Pascal and Gassendi and other important scientists of that day met. His voluminous correspondence with other scientists was a very important means by which scientists learned of each other's work. That's how, there weren't conferences in those days, there weren't scientific journals. Scientists learned of each other's work by correspondence, and the central hub of that correspondence was Marin Mersenne. That's why the Dictionary of Scientific Biography calls him one of the architects of the European scientific community. Christoph Scheiner, a Jesuit astronomer, was one of the discoverers of sunspots and made the most detailed studies of them. There's a picture from his great treatise. That's a picture of him, a woodcut of him in his observatory. And there's a page from one of his treatises on sunspots. The Jesuit astronomer Giovanni Battista Riccioli developed an extensive star catalog and together with his fellow Jesuit Francesco Grimaldi made the first map of the moon's surface. Riccioli developed methods for measuring time precisely with pendulums in experiments and made the first accurate measurement of the acceleration of gravity on the Earth's surface. Recently, it has been discovered that Riccioli discovered the important Coriolis effect. How many have heard of the Coriolis effect? It was actually discovered and studied by Riccioli 200 years before Coriolis. Not to take anything away from Coriolis, who was himself a good Catholic scientist. Francesco Grimaldi, the other Jesuit astronomer and physicist I mentioned, made an extremely important physics discovery of the phenomenon of diffraction of light. If you go into physics, a whole chapter of your freshman physics textbook in college, chapters of your graduate school textbooks are going to be devoted to diffraction. It's an extremely important phenomenon in physics. It shows that light is a wave. And since we now know, because of quantum mechanics, that all particles, all matter is made of waves, diffraction becomes very important in all branches of physics. I showed some pictures here. I don't know how well they come out. The colored bands on a DVD and CD, if people use those anymore, those are diffraction effects. The Benedictine priest, Benedetto Castelli, a friend and student of Galileo, did foundational work in hydraulics and fluid mechanics. His much more famous pupil, Torricelli, discovered the principle of the barometer. Another one of his pupils, Bonaventura Cavalieri, who was himself a priest, made important advances that helped lead to the development of calculus. And as you know, calculus was developed first by Isaac Newton and Leibniz, and here's a quote from Leibniz paying testimony to the contributions of Cavalieri and Torricelli. He says, in the sublimest of geometry, the initiators and promoters were Cavalieri and Torricelli. Later others, namely Leibniz himself, progressed even further based on their work, using their work. One of the greatest biologists of the is Spallanzani. One of the greatest, René Just, I'm skipping somebody. There's Spallanzani, yeah. Spallanzani is considered one of the greatest biologists of the 18th century, with contributions too numerous to mention. René Just Oey is a priest who lived around the time of the French Revolution, is regarded as the founder of crystallography. The first asteroid was discovered by an Italian priest, astronomer, Giuseppe Piazzi. He named it Ceres. It's not only the largest asteroid, but because it is so large, its self-gravity squashes it into a spherical shape, as a result of which it's now been reclassified as a dwarf planet, which puts it on the same level as Pluto, which has been demoted to a dwarf planet. So that was discovered, as I said, the first asteroid and the first dwarf planet was discovered by Piazzi. One of the founders of modern astrophysics, Angelo Secchi, was a Jesuit priest. Astronomy, which is very ancient, is mostly the study of where things appear in the sky and predicting where they're going to be in the sky. But the science which asks, what are these things? What are stars made of? What makes them burn? What makes them, what are the physical processes that go on in outer space? That's astrophysics. And the way we learn most about that historically is through the spectra of light of these objects. And the pioneer in studying the sun and stars using their spectra was Secchi. In fact, he made the first classification of stars based on their spectra, which is the basis of the classification which astronomers still use today. And a nice symbol of the harmony of faith and science is that he did much of his groundbreaking work using an observatory that he had built on the roof of one of the most beautiful churches in Rome, the Church of St. Ignatius. The Czech priest Bernard Bolzano, was a very important mathematician of the 19th century. He helped put mathematics on a rigorous foundation. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, he was an outstanding mathematician and possibly the greatest logician in the time between Leibniz and Frege, which was a 200-year period. Gregor Mendel, he was a Czech priest. Gregor Mendel, the Austrian Augustinian friar, was the founder of the science of genetics. For Notre Dame fans, Father Julius Newland, a professor at Notre Dame, was the co-discoverer of neoprene, the first synthetic rubber. And now here is the clergyman who I had standing with Einstein in the first picture I showed you. He is the founder of the Big Bang Theory, a theoretical physicist and Catholic priest named Georges Lemaitre, or as many call him, Lemaitre. I called him Lemaitre until my French physics friend taught me it was something more like Lemaitre. So that litany of scientist priests is a glorious record of achievement. Entire branches of science, the Big Bang cosmology, genetics, spectroscopy, stellar spectroscopy, geology, and so forth, founded by Catholic priests. In the words of Professor Lawrence Principe of Johns Hopkins University, a leading historian of science, he said, "The Catholic Church has been probably the largest single and longest-term patron of science in history." Okay, so I hope I've shown you that the record of the Catholic Church and Christianity, I could make a long list of I've mentioned many pious, devout Protestant scientists. The record of Catholic Church and Christianity in general, with regard to science, is not something to be embarrassed about. It is actually something quite glorious. So now, in the time left, and I'm getting really short of time, but I have how many pages? I only have a few pages left in my notes. So I would like to mention some of the discoveries of modern physics that seem more in line with a Christian view of the world than with materialism and materialism and atheism. One discovery has to do with the beginning of the universe. The Jewish and Christian view was that the universe had a temporal beginning, a beginning in time. By contrast, the pagan philosophers of antiquity, including Aristotle and Plato, believed that the universe had always existed for infinite time. It was past infinite. And most modern atheists have preferred that view as well. As of 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years ago, the scientific evidence seemed to say that the universe had always existed. And many people came to regard the idea of a beginning, a temporal beginning, as just a relic, as just religious mythology, a relic of a religious view of the world. But now we know that Lemaitre's idea of a Big Bang was correct. There was a Big Bang about 14 billion years ago. In the standard theory of cosmology, that was the beginning of the universe and of time itself. Time, space, matter, all began then. Now, it is possible that something existed before the Big Bang, and there are speculative models or scenarios, they're not yet testable theories, in which there was a prehistory to the universe before the Big Bang. But even if that is the case, there are theoretical arguments that are very strong that favor the idea that the universe almost had to have a beginning a finite time ago, whether at the Big Bang or some earlier point. It's very difficult to construct a sensible theory of a past infinite universe. A second discovery has to do with our place in the universe. For a long time, atheists have said that the evidence shows that human beings are just a cosmic accident, a fluke, in a universe that is totally without purpose. But over the last few decades, primarily physicists, have become increasingly aware that many features of the fundamental laws of physics and the structure of the universe seem to be just right to make the existence of life, complex life such as ourselves, possible. If certain things had been even slightly different about the laws of physics, then we wouldn't be here. These fortuitous features are often called anthropic coincidences. They suggest to many people that we aren't an accident and that the universe does have a purpose, and that part of that purpose is that beings like ourselves should be able to arise in it. I could mention many examples of such fortuitous or anthropic features of the laws of physics and the structure of the universe. If the strong force, for example, that holds nuclei together were slightly weaker, say 20 or 25% weaker, then none of the elements of the periodic table would exist except hydrogen. The same is true had a certain energy level of the carbon-12 nucleus not been very close to its actual value, within a few percent of its actual value. If it had been larger or smaller, almost no chemical elements, almost no carbon or any of the heavier elements would exist, making life almost impossible. The fact that the world is quantum mechanical is very important for the possibility of life. The fact that there are 3 large space dimensions, not 4 or 5 or more, but 3 is very important. If you kept the laws of physics the same but had more than 3 space dimensions, large space dimensions, atoms would be unstable, solar systems would be unstable, planets would crash into their stars or fly off into space. I could go on with examples. Another example, one that I wrote a paper on, it's very widely cited now in the literature, is that there's something called the Higgs field, you've probably heard of. Something called the strength of the Higgs field, or in the jargon, the vacuum expectation value of the Higgs field, has to lie in an incredibly narrow range if you're going to have life in the universe. An very interesting case is the size of the universe and its age. Many people have seen the vast size of the universe compared to us as proving that we are insignificant in the cosmic scheme. But actually, the vast size of the universe is a precondition for us being here. It takes billions of years it takes billions of years for chemical elements required to make living things to evolve by various astrophysical processes. And after you have the chemical elements, it takes further billions of years for those elements to form living things and then complex living things such as ourselves. So you need the universe, if we're going to be here, you need the universe to last for billions of years. Einstein's theory of gravity relates the age of the universe to its size. So, for example, suppose you said, I think the universe is way too big, God shouldn't have made such a big universe. He could have made a universe that was the size of North America. Well, that would have been plenty big. Yes, and the universe would have lasted, if the universe never got larger than the size of North America, it would have lasted for only about 100th of a second. Even a universe the size of the solar system, if it never got bigger than the solar system, which is itself vast compared to human scales, would have only lasted for hours. To have a universe that lasts billions of years, which you need if people like us are to show up on the scene, it has to get to be as big, at least as big as the universe we observe. I will skip the subject of multiverses unless people ask me about it. It's an interesting, that's related to what I just talked about. I'll just stop with can I go for 2 more minutes? Yes. Okay. Or maybe 3, 4? Absolutely. All right. A third development is that physicists have found that the laws of physics are based on very deep mathematical ideas. The universe is not built in some simple-minded way. It's not built with tinker toys, okay? The structure of the universe is governed by laws that are based on very deep mathematics. Let me give you an example. The laws of planetary motion, discovered by Johannes Kepler 400 years ago, involve mathematics that was quite beautiful, but it could have been explained to a bright grade school student in maybe 10 minutes. But Kepler's laws of planetary motion are really based upon deeper laws. They're a result of deeper laws, which are Newton's laws of gravity and mechanics. To understand Newton's laws of gravity and mechanics, you have to know calculus. So already you're talking about a bright high school senior. But Newton's laws of gravity are actually just an outgrowth, they're just a result of yet deeper laws, namely Einstein's theory of gravity. Einstein's theory of gravity requires knowing about curved, four-dimensional, non-Euclidean space-time, tensor analysis, differential geometry, lots of math, which is that you don't typically learn until you're in graduate school. And to learn Einstein's laws of gravity, it doesn't take 10 minutes. It takes a whole semester typically to master it. But now it is believed that Einstein's theory of gravity is really based on a yet deeper layer of mathematics, a deeper law. Very likely what's called superstring theory or string theory. String theory, superstring theory, is so deep mathematically that even though a very large number of the world's most brilliant mathematicians and mathematical physicists have been intensively studying it since 1984, they still do not know and say that they don't fully understand its mathematical structure. Doesn't this suggest that a mind much greater than ours came up with these laws? The more deeply physics has probed the inner workings of the physical world, the more profound and intricate the mathematical structure it has discovered. The architecture of the physical world is not based on the mere amalgamation of stuff, primordial ooze or whatever. It's based on deep math. And that's why the great 20th century physicist James Jeans once remarked, "The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine." And in 1932, and I hope I have this quote up here, yes. In 1932, the great mathematician and mathematical physicist Hermann Weyl said in a lecture at Yale University, "Many people," and he's a very central figure in 20th century physics, I should say, "many people think that modern science is far removed from God. I find, on the contrary, that it is much more difficult today for the knowing person to approach God from history, from the spiritual side of the world, and from morals. For there we encounter the suffering and evil in the world, which it is difficult to bring into harmony with an all-merciful and almighty God. In this domain, we have evidently not yet succeeded in raising the veil with which our human nature covers the essence of things. But in our knowledge of physical nature, we have penetrated so far that we can obtain a vision of the flawless harmony which is in conformity with sublime reason." And this is my last topic. There are discoveries in 20th century physics, especially, that may have something to say about whether we are just material beings made of atoms, or whether there's something more to us than that. One of those discoveries is quantum mechanics. According to some of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, quantum mechanics implies that the human mind is not just something physical. There is more to it than can be explained by the motion of atoms governed by the laws of physics. I should say this is a minority view, but it is a view that has, as I said, been proposed and vigorously defended by some great physicists. Has never really been a good answer to their arguments. For example, Sir Rudolf Peierls said, a famous physicist, "The premise that you can describe in terms of physics the whole function of a human being, including its knowledge and consciousness, is untenable," unquote. And the Nobel Prize winner Eugene Wigner said that materialism, specifically the idea that human minds are just matter in motion, is, quote, "inconsistent with present quantum mechanics." Now, I can't give you an explanation of this. It would take me an hour. There's actually a YouTube video that was mentioned on the Society of Catholic Sciences website where I explain this in about 30 minutes. But I can make a couple of comments. First of all, physics is about matter, and the things physicists measure and the instruments with which they measure them are just matter. So how does quantum mechanics have anything to say about the mind at all? It does so because the people who are making the measurements have minds. So what's being measured is physical, but the measurer in physics, called the observers, have minds, and you cannot fully, when you start asking what goes on during a measurement, you cannot give a fully adequate explanation if you say that everything is just physical. You will end up running into contradictions. Secondly, second point I'll make, quantum mechanics is based at the very fundamental level on probabilities of events happening. Before quantum mechanics, the laws of physics told you what was going to happen. But quantum mechanics showed that that's not how the laws of physics work. The equations of physics, the laws of physics, do not tell you what is going to happen. They tell you the relative probabilities of various things happening. So probabilities are woven into the structure of quantum mechanics at the fundamental level. And what is a probability of an event? It has to do with how much somebody knows. Before the election of 1864, people didn't know who was going to win the election, so they would assign probabilities. But we live after 1864. We know that Lincoln won, so that's not a matter of probabilities, except in the trivial sense we say the probability is 100%. So probabilities are about knowledge, and knowledge requires a mind, and quantum mechanics is about probability. So quantum mechanics ends up telling you something about minds. As I said, well, here's the problem. In quantum mechanics, the laws of physics never give you anything but probabilities. And so if everything was fully described by the laws of physics, you would remain with nothing but probabilities, fluctuating between 0 and 100%. You would be stuck in a realm of probabilities, and nothing definite would actually happen. As long as only material entities are there, you have just probabilities. Whereas you know that when an observer, such as us, observes something, then we know it happened with certainty, and you have a definite outcome. So something happens when we measure things, or we observe things. It takes us out of the realm of probabilities and into the realm of definite outcomes. And that something can't just be purely physical. There's a mind involved. So let me quote the very distinguished philosopher of physics at Princeton University, Professor Hans Halvorson. He said, and here's some quotes, he said, in the case of quantum mechanics, if one presupposes physicalism, that is, that everything is physical, one quickly lands in the measurement problem. There's a very difficult problem called the measurement problem. So anyway, so I'll stop here, and I'll just end with this. Not only has Christianity, including the Catholic Church, been a great friend of science and played a very positive role in its history, but the things discovered by science, contrary to what many people think, have actually in many ways tended to agree with things that we believe as Christians about the universe and about ourselves. That the universe had a beginning, that its very structure seems to be such as to allow living things such as us to appear, that it's built on deep, deep ideas which seem to require a great mind at work, and that human beings and other observers that it is difficult to sustain the idea that we are just physical entities if you believe in the logic of quantum mechanics. And that's where I'll stop.